In this episode, Professor Gigi Foster tells us what she really thinks about Australia's coronavirus hysteria and shares her thoughts on the economic crisis ahead.
Do you understand that a central planned system, that works maybe for a family, for a very small group, but once you try to scale it up, it breaks down very badly.
Rowan Dean goes nuclear.
So we are ideally suited to be a nuclear power, but we have absolutely strangled ourselves by not allowing it to be developed.
Sarah Dudley tells us why Taiwan is the new Czechoslovakia.
Xi Jinping has already force-breathed unification on Hong Kong, and earlier this month told a crowd of 70,000 fanboys in Tiananmen Square that it was his duty to invade Taiwan.
And we're joined by Spectator Australia regulars Alexandra Marshall and James Allan to discuss the best of what the Spectator Australia has had to say.
And so Morrison has set up a world where, Dan Anderson can bring in the world's most sort of heavy-handed lockdowns.
They are frightening how they're going to manipulate our digital world to basically entrap us in COVID, but worse.
All that and more coming up on this new look counterculture right here on Spectator Australia TV. Let's do it. Well, I've said it once, I've said it twice. We on CounterCulture have said it 10,000 times. When it comes to Australia's hysterical, subrational and punitive coronavirus response, the line from our politicians that we're all in this together is a lie and a con. But to be fair to politicians, it looks like we've actually misheard them all along. I don't think they've actually ever said we're all in this together. What they've actually been saying is we're all in this forever. I mean, how else can you explain what's happened over the past couple of weeks? It all started when Gladys Berejiklian, after standing so strong and so firm for so long, finally caved and plunged the better part of New South Wales into lockdown. Now that seemed to give a green light to the other panicky premiers who rushed to whack on their own restrictions, including in South Australia where there weren't even any cases. All of this, we were told, was because not enough of us were lining up to get the jab. But then Queensland's next governor, God help us, went amazingly off script, saying that for younger people, certain vaccines are actually more dangerous than the virus itself. So COVID-19 is so dangerous that we have to keep our businesses shut and our borders closed until we're all vaccinated. But also, you shouldn't get vaccinated because that can be more dangerous than the virus. The virus that's so dangerous that we all simply must get vaccinated, except when we shouldn't. Make sense to you? Or me neither. But not to worry, National Cabinet to the rescue, making this important announcement, giving us our first clue of when all the lockdowns and border closures will finally end.
We're gonna go out there during this break and we're gonna come back with a plan. Okay. We're gonna come back with a plan for you. It's a 45-day plan. 45 days to get us back on track. 45 points. It's a 45-day, 45 point, 1 point per day. We get to 45 points. We're back in business. And you can take that to the bank.
Remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve? How's that one working out? Well, not well, it seems, and it's getting worse. Last year, as terrible and insane as things were in Australia, at least we could all take a weird comfort in the fact that almost every other government in the free world was doing the exact same thing. But we can't say that anymore, not in 2021. The past couple of weeks has shown us that in Australia we have it especially bad. They've shown us that this is not and has never really been a health crisis. It is first and foremost a political crisis, a total failure of our governing institutions to do what they should do, which is to protect our rights and freedoms. It's been a societal and economic war crime by our political and cultural elite against mainstream Australians. As other countries open up and move on, Australia just keeps slipping further into a Kafka-esque death spiral of arbitrary government edict without any underlying objective or rationale whatsoever. Just a stream of base administrative impulse by a political class that has no idea what it's talking about, no idea what it's doing, and no idea how, if ever, this will all end. Now, we at the Spectator Australia and the Institute of Public Affairs are among the very, very first to say no to the lockdowns and border closures that have ravaged Australia. But another person was Professor Gigi Foster from the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales. Here's what she had to say on Q&A of all places, very bravely, during the first wave of lockdowns in April last year.
What frustrates me about this is when people talk about the economic costs of the lockdown, they often don't think in detail in terms of counting lives, as we do with the epidemiological models, for example. So has anyone here actually thought about how would you get a measure of the traded lives? When we lock an economy down, what are we sacrificing in terms of lives?
But we've got time. We don't have what could have been 10,000 lives. Like that's the difference.
Again, have you done the calculus on the other side of the equation?
Are you talking about lost opportunity? Or
I'm talking about lost lives. I'm talking about quality adjusted life years, which is the normal currency that people use when they're making decisions in developed countries about how much to spend on saving people's lives. Because we always have to allocate resources. We don't like to think about this, but it happens all the time, every day in a health ministry in a developed country.
Oh, and by the way, I just have to share this. Here's another bold prediction of another expert on the panel.
The way that the virus has been managed in Australia is probably going to get us back into easing the restrictions and getting our economy back quicker than if we had let it get out of control. Because if we look at countries where that hasn't occurred, then the impact on their economy has been even far more dramatic. So I don't think that there's a solution here that says it's one or the other. It's much more nuanced to that, and protecting people and keeping people out of hospitals will allow us to ease the restrictions much more quickly than if it had run rampant.
Easing restrictions early? Well, all right then. Again, how's that working for you? Anyway, Gigi Foster has co-authored a book documenting this insanity, a book called The Great COVID Panic, which will be released later this year. She joins me now. Gigi Foster, welcome to CounterCulture. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing very well, Gideon. Yourself?
Well, it's great to have you. It's great to have a fellow lockdown skeptic. It's great to have a fellow person on the show who speaks truth to power. So it's a very relevant time to be discussing these things. So looking at what happened in Sydney and Brisbane and Perth and Alice Springs and everything else over the last couple of weeks or so, your professional opinion, what the hell just happened?
Look, whatever just happened has been happening for more than a year now, a year and a half almost. And as you know, I've been decrying it, you've been decrying it. There have been a few lone voices, but in about April last year, I was still predicting that everybody would kind of get over the craziness and we would get back to normal business by certainly mid-year or end of the year. And it's just stretched on and on and on and on. And the kinds of treatment that people who would counter the narrative were receiving in the public space were just unreal. And I'd never seen them before. I mean, I was defamed on Twitter. I was sent death threats. You probably had similar kinds of treatment. People were calling me a granny killer, a neoliberal Trump cannot death cult warrior, go back to your Yankee past land, all this horrible stuff. And, I don't know about you, Gideon, but I'm a very nice person, actually. I mean, very few people hate me. And I'm just full of love for humanity. So having these sorts of epithets and name calling and just general rejection for me was just extremely shocking. Fortunately, I have a very supportive family and group of friends, so I'm fine mentally. But boy, it was an incredibly educative time for me as a social scientist. And this is one of the reasons why, I was so curious about what was going on that I thought, look, I've got to write about this. I've got to analyze what's happened and put it into a form that, at least for me and for the other lockdown skeptics, makes some sense of what we have been seeing.
I mean, I know the feeling. I know exactly the feeling. When I and the IPA came out against lockdowns, I was slagged off on social media and the death threats started and everything else. But privately, I got a lot of messages of support for people who were struggling. So was that the same for you? Did you get the same people who said, thank you for saying what I can't?
Absolutely. That's exactly the pattern. So on private email mainly, and sometimes private LinkedIn messages, private messages of any sort where the person couldn't be identified by the wider crowd, I received the most loving, supportive, praising emails that I've ever received in my life. People likening me to Joan of Arc, saying I'm a godsend, you're going to save Australia. I mean, these crazy, amazing things, which for me, I was simply speaking truth. There's not anything really special about that. But in this time, it was clear that many people who felt the same way that you and I felt about it, were observing the same things and worried about the same things, felt unable to express those opinions in public. And even when I say public, even sometimes at their workplaces, even around the dinner table sometimes, because just like the election of Trump, I think, really sort of divided America, sometimes right down the dining table. The whole experience during COVID and the lockdowns really has divided Australia, sometimes right down professional groups and families and community groups, where people look at each other now and think, what, you supported what? You're crazy. I never would have imagined, and then you also find common cause with groups that you never thought you would. I mean, did I really ever think that I'd be interviewed by the IPA for a podcast? Not really, I kind of didn't. Or that I'd be on Sky News like a dozen times, or that people who were on the fringe right-wing conspiracy theorist extremist bunch, thinking Hillary Clinton was a lizard person and stuff like that, would write to me and say how wonderful they thought I was. I mean, it was a very, very weird period in terms of shifting allegiances and people who previously thought they knew each other thinking that suddenly they didn't. Yeah, and it's an interesting divide, isn't it? Because instead of the usual right versus left, liberal versus Labor, we had, I guess, the, working people or people who are outside the political and cultural elite who were suffering from lockdowns and in the main opposed them, or in large part opposed them, and the managerial elite. But for people who, for the majority of our audience who isn't in the habit of watching Q&A, I mean, what was your message that really ticked the lockdown lovies off? Well, I mean, I think one of the components of my message that they heard in a distorted fashion was that we need to not lock down people and not prevent them from doing what they would normally do in a functioning economy, because that locking down, that prevention of normal activity will eventually, either at the time or in a short or medium or long run way, cause death. It will cause costs to be paid, which are not being counted at the moment when we're making these lockdown policies. Now, what people heard from that message was, oh, she thinks that the economy, read dollars, profits, stock returns, is more important than life. What a bitch. Right. So that's what they heard. Now, what in fact I was trying to say, and I've really got a lot of practice during this period trying to communicate clearly about this, is that when you prevent an economic system, a healthy economic system, from just chugging along and having everybody at the coalface in their particular part of that economy do what they think is best based on the signals they're receiving locally, you essentially reduce the production and the productivity and the capacity of the entire system to provide human well-being. And that connection of a healthy functioning economy on the one hand to good outcomes for people on the other is something that I think has really been blurred a lot for people in Australia. And it's not just a modern phenomenon. I think this has been happening gradually over the course of the last 20 years or so. As you may know, enrollments in economics classes in high school have dropped precipitously, something like 70% since the early 90s. And I generally find that there's just a very, very low level of economic literacy in many adults, not just children, but adults right now when I've been talking to them. And so I have to, in my emails, when I have received negative emails, I always engage fully with them and I try to open their eyes. And I find myself having to go back to literally high school economics. Do you understand that a central planned system, that works maybe for a family, for a very small group, but once you try to scale it up, it breaks down very badly. And you have to really explain that step by step by step and point to historical examples about what we've tried in the past, about how to organize societies and why it doesn't work and why we want everybody to love each other and feel good and do the right thing by each other. But building a society based on the assumption that people are never going to be greedy is going to destroy those very lives that you're claiming you want to protect. So that has been a really interesting aspect of this as well, to see the low level of economic literacy. And that segues nicely into your wonderful book. As I said, I got to read a draft yesterday for this interview. I just absolutely loved it. I loved that you and your co-authors tried to make sense of the senseless. You tried to catalogue
and rationalise something that's inherently irrational, and that is what you call very aptly the Great Panic. So tell us about the book, which I understand is due for release in around September, about your co-authors, and really how the book came about, because as I said, it's an extraordinary academic work.
Thank you. Thank you for the praise, Gideon, the advanced praise. Yes, we're hoping for September, and certainly by the Christmas season, but September for the e-version is what we're pushing for. So the book is called The Great COVID Panic, and we started working on it, maybe a little less than a year ago. And it really came about because myself and one of the co-authors, whose name is Paul Frieders, he's a professor at the London School of Economics, he and I have been writing for a long time, over a decade, on a number of different topics, but particularly the big questions in social science that economics hasn't really grappled with particularly well yet, in terms of feeding them an understanding of them into what we teach our undergraduates, and that become sort of known in policy circles as the way to think about problems. And in particular, those big ideas include loyalty, groups, power, networks, things that have to do with interpersonal interaction, relationships. And so what those kinds of commitments that are not about prices and explicit markets really make us do, how they motivate us, and how they can change our behavior. So having had that sort of initial work, in fact, I've got this initial book that we wrote about, 8 years ago, An Economic Theory of Greed, Love, Groups, and Networks. Paul and I wrote that book together, and that book really was kind of an overarching theory of these big phenomena and an application to economic analysis of what we understood those phenomena to really be about. And so then the COVID period really provided us an application of many of those ideas. And Paul and I were both independently at the beginning of COVID battling against the crazy narratives that were going on in both the UK, where he's based, and Australia, where I'm based. We collaborated on a number of different pieces and analysis, and we would sanity check each other. And it just became so overwhelmingly obvious that this was the big issue of hopefully of our generation, that really we needed to, and we were some of the few people who seemed to see what was happening clearly. And we felt well positioned to be able to analyze it through these lenses of group dynamics, power and networks and loyalty and things, that we just felt we had to write this. We had to write a book. And he had been blogging a lot anyway, so there's a lot of material from those blogs. I've been speaking to the media constantly pretty much during this period, and writing academic papers of my own. So we were able to draw bits of content from different places and put it into a structure. We also then brought on Michael Baker, who was a writer for the lay audience. He's actually an economic consultant. And he was really the sort of checker of the communication style, the tone, whether this was going to speak to the guy on the street, because, Paul and I are kind of eggheads. And so we sort of write a little bit too abstractly sometimes. So that's the authorship team. And really it's a love project. I mean, I'm so happy to be able to, I feel so fortunate to be able to produce this kind of work. And I feel so honored, to be honest, to have been able to serve Australia as one of the proponents of sense during this period. So it's great to be able to put that into a book form as well. Going back to the beginning, and you told the story through the eyes of a few characters, one of whom was Jane, who was the COVID believer, the real, social distance warrior. So take us back to where it all began, how the panic erupted in the eyes of a Jane. What it was like. Even now, just over a year later, it's easy to forget what that pervasive hysteria looked like. So take us back to the very beginning and what the Janes of the world were feeling. Yes, absolutely. So this was in maybe February of 2020, and there were early signs of some new virus having been found in China. And my son actually was in Boston at the time, and he was seeing these memes about how somebody ate a bat in China, right? And some people were saying, very dangerous, very scary. But by and large, most people were seeing it as just another virus, whatever. We get viruses all the time. And politicians as well were saying, look, most people recover from this thing. It's not a big deal. But things changed markedly around the middle of March. This was when Neil Ferguson's group released their modeling, which is now infamous. And many places around the world were receiving these streaming videos, even if they were very far from where the virus was hitting. They were receiving these videos and pictures of places that the virus had hit that showed, very scary, depictions of what the virus could do. So from China, from Rome, from Italy, we were seeing pictures of people on the streets, just in body bags, people on ventilators, very scary. And suddenly the messages of the politicians began to change into, we need to worry about this actually. And of course, the media headlines were right up there with, if it bleeds, it leads. So this earlier is bleeding. We're going to stick it on the front page. So the Janes of the world who basically don't have a lot of mental strength, is essentially what it is, not good at dealing with a crisis, not very courageous, can't really continue to think for themselves, are very willing or very susceptible of being possessed by fear in a moment of crisis, right? The person you don't want when your house is burning down, right? That's Jane, right? They looked at these signals from around themselves, including the social media, the regular media, the politicians, other people. They looked at the stores where there were these panic buying episodes where you wouldn't be able to find toilet paper. The stock market where there were these massive falls. And, even if Jane didn't really understand finance, she knew that a falling stock market was probably bad, right? I mean, it happened in the 1929 period, right? When we entered into the worst depression for a century. So she started to get really, really fearful. And indeed, it was that fearfulness that then continued to feed into the politicians' actions and responses to this. And so there became this vicious cycle of fear and hysterical response and more fear and more hysterical response until it became sort of inevitable that if any politician who wanted to preserve his seat, right, wanted to preserve his reputation, needed to be seen to do something about this huge threat. And note the wording there, right? Needed to be seen to do something. Not necessarily to do anything to really address the threat, but to be seen to be addressing it. And so that is where the call for locking down, the call for closing schools, the call for wearing the masks and socially distancing, that's where all of that sort of thing started to come from, because that's what Jane wanted. She wanted to be shown a path to control the fear. The fear that was possessing her. And the politicians showed her that. Oh, look, you can take away your liberties. You can, not see your kids anymore or not see your old parents anymore. You not send the kids to school. You can wear masks. You can stop going to work. You can, all these things. And those massive, heavy sacrifices are in service to reducing the threat of this horrible external, virulent pestilence that she was so petrified of. And so it helped her psychologically to control that wave of fear that was constantly, coming up in her. So that's essentially where we think it came from.
But listening to those first few tremors before the hysteria tsunami, what's striking is they're all debunked. The Neil Ferguson modelling was complete garbage. The footage from Wuhan of people falling over and it was staged. There were people who, seemed to have fainted, but it showed that they, were faking it because they stuck their leg out to catch themselves and so on. So, but those things explain why we panicked then in March 2020. We are now in July 2021 and we are still panicking despite everything we now know. Now, the reason why that is, I think, would cause us to introduce the James into this story. And James is the figure who represents the swamp, basically, the bureaucrat, the politician, the publicly funded person purporting to be a scientist, so on and so on. So tell us about how the Great Panic was seized upon opportunistically or otherwise by people who as he said, that impulse for governments to just do something, anything.
So first I'll say that in the current version of the book, we are thinking about changing James's name to something else. So it might be Julian or Jeffrey, we're not sure. But in any event, we're sick of trying to pluralize and make possessives of James. So in any event, James, I see it more as a kind of an opportunist, I suppose. That's the best way to describe him. So he is, as you say, at the helm of companies. He's in government or close to government. He is in powerful positions in many countries all over the world. And what happened was he's not like the Jane character in the sense that he tries to basically manage his way through a crisis without letting his fear overcome him. He keeps a cool head. And he looks for ways to advance himself. In some sense, in fact, James is the canonical character in most economic models. He's homo economicus. He will look for an arbitrage opportunity and grab it with both hands. And it doesn't matter what he really has to do. He's amoral. He sort of just does the thing that will advance him the most. And in some sense, we know in economics that this is how a lot of people really act, even though many of our sister social sciences don't like to think that that's true. And it's on the basis of James's character that we advise particular kinds of institutions like laws that prevent people from killing each other or stealing from each other, for example, right? Or contract laws that can be enforced, those sorts of things, which promote a positive channeling of those kinds of impulses rather than a destructive channeling of them, shall we say. So James, in March and April and May and continuing on, started to see opportunity for himself. He started to see that politicians were being demanded to provide a response and that he could be part of that response. He could help the society to respond and could bill it that way. And Jane would swallow that hook, line, and sinker, and the politicians would be grateful. There was basically no downside. If he could just figure out how to make masks, for example, or if he could just figure out how to secure a contract for PPE or for, extra cleaning or for, more border security people or whatever it was that the whole COVID machinery was demanding. And so the clever opportunists amongst us grabbed those opportunities and became quite linked up with the politicians. And in the climate at that time, there weren't a lot of careful weighings up of whether or not this contract really should be awarded to this person, right? There was just quick and, shoot from the hip sorts of decisions being made about all manner of things that caused hundreds of millions of dollars to land right into the lap of the cleverest James. And that, of course, then created a kind of cycle as well. So the politicians were now locked into doing business with these James, or they were in, the Jameses themselves were in government and they were contracting with places outside to get this money, and they were getting more powerful, the politicians, and the Jameses were getting richer as well. And so there was this whole kind of feeding off of itself that the system began to do. And at the same time that this was happening, we also had amongst the Janes, a creation of this kind of dynamic that I just was not anticipating. This dynamic of the herd, of the crowd. Yeah. Something I just never, because we haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. I didn't think I had seen it in my lifetime. And it really went along with the vicious cycle of the Jameses and served to perpetuate his opportunities to continue to basically profit for himself on the back of the society's welfare.
Yeah, and that's something I really wanted to touch on because, again, I make the point, the book brings in so many concepts to rationalise and to explain what happened, and you brought in the psychology of crowds and the economics of crowds. So could you talk us through, in a very, very brief sense, what those theories are and I guess how they came into their own with the Janes of the world during this great panic?
Sure. So a crowd is something that most of your viewers won't be familiar with, except in relation to the COVID period, but was quite evident in previous generations. One of the types of crowds that you may be familiar with, probably most familiar with, is the Nazi Germany crowds. So when Hitler had those rallies, right? So a crowd is distinguished by its focus on one particular thing, right? An obsession about one particular thing. And everybody's obsessed about that thing all at once together. And there's a sense of community about it, right? We are linked in with each other. We are close to each other. We are secure. We are not lonely because we all adhere to this one obsession. We think this is the most important thing, right? And that creates a sort of glue that is extremely difficult to dislodge, to dissolve, right? Very difficult. And in the crowd, the people who belong, who have this shared obsession, kind of have a sort of fluid morality and a fluid sense of what really is true. And that's what you saw in these Hitler rallies, for example, right? So people would simply immediately agree to pronouncements that they would normally, if they weren't in the crowd, take decades to weigh up. Is it really true that my Jewish neighbor is out to get me somehow, even though, his father and my father fought together in the First World War or something like that, right? But this notion that, oh, yes, they're all evil. Yep. And people just bought into that in a crowd. That shows you how much the sense of morality and the seeking of truth becomes outsourced by the crowd member to the crowd leader. And so whatever the crowd thinks, that's what truth is. And it's always fluid. Whatever at the moment the crowd thinks is true, that's what the individual crowd person, the member of the crowd, believes and will act on, right? And the kinds of actions that a crowd will take are these wild sacrificial actions, again, in service to this, perceived threat or whatever the narrative is. So in the case of the Nazis, it was, well, we just have to kill them all. Yeah. Let's kill them all, right? Massive, massive human sacrifice on the basis of this one obsession. With COVID, I mean, I won't say it was literally people being shot or gassed, but it was definitely people being deprived of basic human freedoms, being deprived of happiness, and it was being done by crowds that were populated particularly by fanatical people who themselves suffered from having some kind of repression. So I noticed in this period that some of the most radical, fanatical Jane types who were belonging to this, pro-lockdown crowd were actually quite lonely people. Yeah. They were people who, seemed a bit dysfunctional psychologically. They weren't really happy. They hadn't really settled or found a place for themselves. They didn't have a good sense of their own self-control, perhaps, but they had to kind of stifle all this stuff in their normal lives. But in a crowd, they could sort of let it all out and visit all of this nastiness that was almost in line with what they themselves had oppressed or suppressed in previous times onto others. So it was a vehicle for mass bullying and mass deprivation of basic rights and freedoms that the Janes felt in some sense was, again, a worthy sacrifice, maybe because they themselves had to, suppress kind of these problems that they had when in normal times. And somehow there's a logic to that, which, is more psychological than really we understand, but it's just observationally that seems to be true. And so that ended up perpetuating this kind of group crime, basically, throughout the months and months and months of the lockdowns continuing. So the crowd logic and the logic of the sacrifice built into the crowds, plus James feeding the whole thing, and capitalizing on it and sending out all sorts of messages about how it was very necessary that we had these PPE and these lockdowns and these this and these that, because that fed right into his bottom line, right? It all worked together to create an extended period of massive welfare destruction.
Look, that segues beautifully into what I want to ask you next, and something I found very intriguing from the Great Panic. We're hearing a lot about vaccines. It's the latest, I guess, receding finish line that we're chasing, heading towards. Finally, after saying it was to flatten the curve, it was to reduce deaths, it was to do this and that and everything else. The next promise is, this will all be over if you get vaccinated. I don't believe them for a second. But you wrote in the book, mass vaccination programs contain the seeds of their uselessness in them, whilst being costly and disruptive, with many side effects as well. They were, in effect, a mass medical experiment with unknown long-term costs and benefits. Well, talk us through that one. That's a very brave call.
Well, first of all, the reason why mass vaccination programs had the seeds of their own uselessness. Coronaviruses in general, like many viruses, mutate over time. So it was pretty clear pretty early on that this virus was going to mutate. And they mutate more when you partially treat them. So if you give a vaccination to somebody and it's not 100% effective, oftentimes the remaining bugs that are in their body can learn to fight back against that vaccine, and then it develops a new strain, right? So when you have, vaccination that isn't completely effective, you have this acceleration of the mutation process, and mutation was already going to happen anyway. So like flu bugs mutate every year, right? We know this. We have new versions of the flu shots every year. This was always going to be kind of the same thing based on what we have seen previously with coronaviruses. And so the idea that there was going to be a silver bullet at the end of this whole thing, there would be a vaccination and then we would never more have the disease, was just always a fantasy, right? Was always going to be a situation of trying to contain and control the worst symptoms and having to just get on with our lives with a new bug in the mix, right? That was always, from probably about July or so last year, that seemed to be what we were going to inevitably have to do. So in terms of the side effects and whatnot, we've been seeing adverse effects, of course, and this mRNA technology is very new. Some people think it's the best thing since sliced bread. Other people, including very, famous doctors, including some who even had a hand in inventing the technology, have some reservations, certainly about giving it to children. And, I don't think that it's for sure a home run thing. It certainly seems like on balance, it does prevent or lessen the chance of serious effects for older people, which is, of course, the vulnerable group. And so, what I've been advocating for is if somebody who's over 65 really wants the vaccine, give it to them. If they want it, fine. Get the GP to consult with them and make sure they understand the costs and benefits as much as we know them now, and then have them have the vaccine. But to have this idea that a population vaccination rate of say 80% or whatever is required without regard to age or susceptibility to COVID as a precondition for opening the country is madness. I mean, that's saying we have to do something to our whole population, which it doesn't seem like it would necessarily pass the cost benefit test, certainly for children to get this vaccination in order to regain a basic freedom. So that's not part of the social contract that I signed up for. And I think a lot of Australians as well. So,
to the extent there is vaccine hesitancy, as our friends in the mainstream media would call it, I think it's because those reservations, those scientists who do have problems with it, I'm not saying they're right, I'm not saying they're wrong. Again, I'm not a doctor. You'll never hear from them because they're either being censored by big tech or having their careers threatened. That is a feature, again, not just of the coronavirus debate, but especially of the coronavirus debate. And that is something that you've also touched on in the book, the monoculture that's fallen over our universities, our public institutions, the political and cultural in general. And you've called for a lot more of what you call radical diversity. So finally, Gigi Foster, what does radical diversity look like and why do we need it?
So radical diversity is this notion that what really helps to promote human welfare in the long run and innovation and discovery of the best ways to do things at a particular time is the consideration of vast different views, really, really different, from seeing the same data and interpreting it completely differently to even seeing different data and saying, well, based on my truth, this is the way we should go. Right? What you want is to have the ability of your institutions to gather together in a moment of crisis, particularly people who have extremely disparate views based on their very different perspectives, approaches, data collections, whatever, and be able to kind of tussle it out and respect each other and not have canceling, right? The opposite of cancel culture, basically. And even if the ideas seem completely nutty, just let them have a seat at the table. Now it will be more inefficient in some ways, right? And that's the seductiveness of the monoculture, right? It's just so much easier. You can just turn your brain off and just say, I accept the narrative, right? That's very easy.
That's the consensus.
And that's the seductiveness of it. Right. So you have to be willing to accept that actually on the altar of delivering a better result for the group, you need to pay a bit of cost in terms of additional inefficiency in that institution of radical diversity within your decision-making bodies. And so we advocate for certain kinds of institutions like citizen juries to assist in the appointment of certain heads of departments and making certain kinds of decisions, because we just think that that's the way you're going to get a representation of the different views out there. And indeed by people who are not already linked in with this kind of James network, right? Where they're going to get kickbacks if certain views are adopted or whatever, right? So you'll just get their actual honest view about, well, who would be the best person to lead the health department, rather than getting a politician to appoint somebody who may have given a job to his cousin's best friend's dog or whatever it is, right? So this notion of radical diversity is something that we really came to after observing what had happened in the U.S. So the United States is unique in the way that it sort of delivers to the world kind of clumsily, in some sense, 50 different experiments about how to run stuff, right? Because their federal system is very, extreme compared to ours. And so you had different states pursuing radically different truths, basically, right? So South Dakota and Texas and Florida, very different from California and Boston, Massachusetts and whatever. And so what we saw were, 50 different little petri dishes. And when you allow that kind of experimentation, and essentially, you can't cancel Florida, you can't cancel them, right? They're going to do it. So you're going to try, but it's still there, and you can't sort of push it down into the mud. Well, it is sinking, but in any event, you're going to see what happens when a state pursues a particular truth. And so then you almost can't help but be forced to reckon with the fact that, oh, gee, maybe they were right.
Yeah.
So some of the craziest groups in the US who were, arguing that Hillary Clinton was a lizard person and whatnot, they've had some of the most sensible notions of what we should do policy-wise during this period. And if we had more of that kind of vociferous, rejection of narrative here in Australia, perhaps we would not now be the laughingstock of the world.
If there's anything that is the most tragic thing about what we have gone through over the last 18 months or so, it is the nagging thought that all of the heartbreak, the anguish, the destruction, the stifling of our way of life, it could all have been avoided if we just had more voices in the debate. But in the meantime, Gigi Foster, thank you so much for being a very strong part of the counterpoint and the counter debate amid this hysteria. Thank you so much for coming on today. Looking forward to seeing the book in print later in the year, and looking forward to keeping in touch as this story unfolds and heads towards its inglorious end.
Thank you, Gideon. It's been my pleasure to have a talk.
Now, that was just a small segment of my interview with Professor Gigi Foster. We'll be putting up the full version along with all our extended interviews right here on Spectator Australia TV on YouTube. So make sure you hit that subscribe button down below so you don't miss a thing. And make sure you give this video a like as well while you're at it. As always, we need all the help we can get in beating that big tech algorithm and getting our message out. And if you're liking this show, you will love Morning Double Shot, a daily edition of Spectator Australia goodness brought to you by editor Terry Barnes. Terry is up bright and early, scanning the news and offering you your first shot of comment for the day and helping you make sense of whatever madness the morning news brings, as well as your daily highlights of what the Spectator Australia is saying about the issues that matter. And now, as always, it's time to hear from Editor-in-Chief of the Spectator Australia, Rowan Dean. And now it is a great pleasure to welcome back our dear and esteemed leader, the Sultan of the Sensible Centre, the Mufti of mainstream Australians, the Editor-in-Chief of the mighty and great Spectator Australia magazine, the great Rowan Dean. Rowan, how are you, mate? It's been too long.
It has been too long, Gideon. I've had some fantastic introductions, but that's the one I treasure the most. The Mufti of mainstream Australia. That'll do me.
Well,
happy with that one.
I'm sure it'll do Paul Barry on Media Watch too, or we hope. G'day, Paul. Anyway, mate, great to have you back. So firstly, I have to ask, what's in the editorial this week? I understand you're putting forward a bold new proposal that the Liberal Party and the National Party and the Coalition should take heed of.
Well, precisely, Gideon. You've got to have a catchy headline, don't you? And so I couldn't resist how the Coalition can win the next election. But there's a serious note to it. And if you remember back in 1998, John Howard took to the election the GST. Now, at the time, of course, Gideon, you are far too young to remember this, but at the time, all the pundits, all the experts all over the airwaves said this is an absolute folly. There's no way that Howard can win, putting forward such a strong and, controversial idea. You're asking people to vote to raise their own taxes. Who would on earth do that, et cetera, yada, yada, yada. But of course, those of us, and I wasn't involved in this sort of thing at the time, but my instinct was, well, it sounds like a sensible proposal. And I think that's what most Australians felt, that almost the fact that the government was putting forward what was so clearly a negative kind of sold itself. It was like, wow, if they're this kind of crazy brave to put this forward, it really must be the right thing to do. And so it turned out. Not only did John Howard win that election, which was introducing a GST, he won the subsequent election, which was after the GST had come in, with all the kind of mayhem that had involved, and he won the subsequent election after that. Even by then that the GST was part of the fabric of life. So if you go forward with a strong policy, Gideon, you can convince the electorate if the policy itself is sound. Now, what's my version of the GST? Well, it is to lift the moratorium on nuclear energy in Australia. So back in the Whitlam years, a moratorium, or I forget exactly when it was, but the moratorium came in on nuclear energy so that although there is one nuclear power station, a very small one in the suburbs of Sydney for medical purposes, basically there's no nuclear energy in Australia, despite the fact we have the world's largest, resources of uranium. We have the best, and we have the best way of disposing of nuclear We are a solid continent. We're not prone to earthquakes and so on. So we are ideally suited to be a nuclear power, but we have absolutely, strangled ourselves by not allowing it to be developed. Now's the time for the coalition to say, okay, if you seriously believe this net zero stuff, then we have to go nuclear. We have to lift the moratorium on nuclear energy, which will allow investment to take place, which will allow individual states or even towns, if they so choose, to go, hey, you know what, we need a new small modular nuclear reactor to give us the energy we need. By lifting the moratorium on nuclear energy, Gideon, they will also lift the lid on hypocrisy of the Greens and the Labor Party, because these clowns have been telling us for years that they're so desperately concerned about net zero emissions that the danger from coal, etc., and cars and all the rest is so severe that we have to completely strip our economy down, get rid of our industrial base, return to some kind of Neanderthal type society. Well, if they really believe net zero is so critical, if they really believe that climate change is such a dire existential threat, then they must vote yes to nuclear power. But of course, Gideon, if the coalition put it up as a policy, you would see the Labor Party tear themselves apart. You would have people like Joel Fitzgibbon who would say, yep, it's a good idea. I assume he would. You would have most of the lovies going, no, we can't possibly do this. And it would expose the sheer hypocrisy of these people. So I'm saying if the coalition did this, they would romp in at the next election.
I've always been a little bit skeptical about nuclear insofar as I think if we absolutely have to do this net zero business, then it's a no-brainer. But that's not exactly something that I put a lot of premium on, and neither do you. So I'm a bit of a cold hugger. I'm a bit more old school. I think we should just power our cities with
I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that, Gideon. But let's be realistic here. The next election will take place either just before or just after the Glasgow meeting, which is another one of these climate fests. And already Scott Morrison has made it pretty clear that he's going to either pay lip service to this idea of net zero emissions. And we had Boris Johnson patting him on. We don't know what was said in private between Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison, but Boris Johnson came out beaming after the Cornwall G7 meeting saying, good old Australia, they're heading off to net zero. So if we are, I'm sorry, mainstream Australia can't put up with this garbage any longer.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with you. Let's stick with coal. I'm absolutely 100% with that. But the reality is our government's not doing that. They don't appear to be prepared to do that. So lift the embargo on nuclear and let's see who really believes in net zero.
Yeah, and look, again, you're not wrong. We are where we are. And you're right. I think it would be a debate that would at least focus national attention on something beyond just, shoveling piles of money into God knows which direction to keep our economy chugging along as best it can, despite the lunacy of what's been done to it over the course of the last 18 months. But anyway, wanted to also ask you about, given it has been a while between drinks, what was one of your, one of the highlights for you as editor over the last month? What do you have for us?
Well, there's been some terrific articles. There's been a lot of really interesting articles about vaccination, mandatory vaccination. Ramesh Thakur always writes superbly, as does Rebecca Weiser on that topic and many of the others. I just wanted to mention today, Gideon, a terrific article by David Adler, who writes frequently, particularly on Jewish matters, but not exclusively, in The Spectator. He's the head of the Australian Jewish Association. And thanks to his writing in The Spectator, we actually saw the Australian government remove $10 million of Australian taxpayers' money that was going to fund terror outfits in Gaza via Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So that was David Adler, work done with The Spectator, with Andrew Irvin involved in that. And he writes very poignantly on matters that are happening in the Middle East. And he really lifts the lid on these summer camps that are taking place in Gaza now. We all have this fond idea that, it's obviously summer in the Northern Hemisphere, equally in the Southern Hemisphere. A summer camp is a time for the kids to go and learn some sports, or time to go canoeing or kayaking, or whatever it might be, learning how to fish or do sports. But now in Gaza and the Palestinian authorities, if your kid goes to summer camp, he's off to learn how to murder Jews. That's the bottom line, with kids being taught basic terror tactics, terror training. That's what happens in summer camps. in the Palestinian Authority and in the Gaza Strip. And let's not forget, Gideon, that the Australian Labor Party would immediately, if they were to win the next election, recognize Palestine as a matter of urgency and a top priority. So you would have the summer camps legitimized under a Labor rule. And these are the summer camps that teach kids, young kids, as young as whatever, 5, 6, through to their teens, to murder their fellow Jewish neighbors.
That's right. And as I've always said in all of these debates, I am obviously, for many, many reasons, a dyed-in-the-wool Israel supporting Zionist. But, it's not as if we are not sympathetic to the Palestinian people. But the fault of their misery is not with Israel. It's with their corrupt, murderous leadership. And it's not just summer camps, Rowan. It's things like school books have all sorts of lies about Jews written in them. Television's programming, if you look up Palestinian Media Watch on YouTube, where, they're, like Barney the dinosaur spouting jihadist messages, all that sort of craziness. So this is something that is a deep issue. It is an impediment to peace. But, when do you see the ABC or the Labor Party talking about that? Not very often. But I love David Adler. We love David Adler on this show. We've had him a number of times in the past. And fun fact, as a result of me speaking at a gathering of the Australian Jewish Association back in late 2019, I met a fantastic woman who introduced me to her daughter, and a week or so back we got engaged. So great things can happen with a great Australian Jewish Association. But in the meantime, Rowan,
we're going to chalk that up as yet another Spectator-induced marriage, if you like. There's been several of them now.
Well,
Spectator Australia. If you don't read it for the articles, then read it for the marriage guidance tips.
Well, what about? Well, here's an idea. The logical conclusion of all this is a Spectator Australia dating app. Why not? Spectator readers up with each other. Meet like-minded people who share your values. You won't have to, be afraid of what you say on a date. I think this could be a goer, a new money spinner for the magazine.
Fantastic, love it, Gideon.
Excellent,
Thanks, mate.
Great to see you as always, mate. Catch up next time.
You too. See ya.
And remember, if you want to read more from our outstanding stable of talent at The Spectator Australia, just head right on over to spectator.com.au. And if you like what you see, and we know that you will, subscribe to The Spectator Australia today to get instant access to all of our outstanding content, including the weekly Spectator Australia magazine, all the articles in our online section, flat white, and great international authors like Douglas Murray, Brendan O'Neill, James Dillingpole, and many, many more. Just call 1-800-809-233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. And now it's time to hear what The Spectator Australia has had to say over the last month when we review our most talked about and most read pieces in the magazine and online. And joining me to do that are two absolute fan favourites here at CounterCulture, the lovely Alexandra Marshall and the great Professor James Allan. Welcome to you both. Now, Jim, I'll start with you. We had this great piece.
I think I'm lovely too, by the way. Just want you.
You're both lovely and you're both great. Make Spectator Australia TV great again. So, Jim, I'll start with you. Now, we had this piece by Ramesh Thakur, which basically says that, one of the few countries, firstly, that stuck to its actual pandemic plan. Remember that the WHO, as late as October 2019, was not recommending lockdowns in any circumstances to deal with pandemics. One of the few countries that actually kept its head was Sweden, and against all the predictions of the doommongers, it actually came out better than a lot of countries in Europe and around the world that had lockdowns. So, Jim, over to you. What do you make of this this correction here? Do we owe the Swedes an apology?
Oh, well, I've been a big fan of Sweden for a long time. Firstly, let me just say that Ramesh is fantastic, and you're hearing it first here. Ramesh and I are thinking of starting a political party that will be dedicated to no lockdowns, and then that's our only policy. So anybody across the political spectrum, protest vote. The Sweden's hated by a lot of people because they stuck by the pre-December 2019 advice. They targeted their care for people who were vulnerable. They screwed up. The Swedes admit they screwed up the old age home sector, but when you look at the data in Sweden, yes, they have more excess deaths than some of the other Scandinavian countries, but they have fewer excess deaths than I think it's the year 2018 backwards. So this whole pandemic Sweden is showing us that this whole lockdown despotism is to take us back, to stop taking us back to the number of deaths we had in about 2008. It's a center-left government that stood by its principles. So when I say center-left, I mean a good deal to the right of Scott Morrison. Sweden, Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis, Kristi Noem in South Dakota. These are some leaders who've stood up to the sort of coterie of public health people who make only one matrix of any importance, and that's COVID deaths. They don't look at deaths caused by the lockdown itself. They don't look at missed cancer checks. They don't care at all about any freedom-related concerns. So I think Sweden's been great. And, on the worst case scenario, we're talking about a country where, like the rest of the West, the average age of COVID deaths is higher than the life expectancy.
Add that, according to Ramesh's piece, we all know the famous Neil Ferguson bungled COVID modelling predicting, tens of thousands of deaths, which was way off. Using their modelling, Sweden's COVID deaths were supposed to reach 96,000 by the end of May last year. Now, Ramesh writes that the actual number at that time was just 4,403. So, again, the Swedish model has been vindicated. The modelers and the experts have been discredited yet again, like they are perennially over climate change. Yet these same health authoritarians are still large and in charge, and for reasons I don't understand, they still have their credibility and their gravitas. And that segues into...
It's just unbelievable that we pay any attention to these people, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But we still are. And especially now after everything we all know about the goings-on with Anthony Fauci. And on that note, Rebecca Weiser wrote an excellent piece about, the origins of the coronavirus and the hand that Fauci and, a bunch of acolytes in big public health in the US had with that. Now, I do take issue with one thing Rebecca said. She said, comparing the COVID lockdowns to Tiananmen Square, she wrote, the West was equally horrified, equally to Tiananmen Square, at the outset of this pandemic by the brutality of the repression exercised by the CCP against the coronavirus. No, we weren't. We basically copied their model. The Western governments, instead of seeing people being welded into their own apartment buildings, instead of saying, oh, well, that's terrible, we shouldn't have that in a free country, they said, oh, gee, this virus looks pretty serious, we'd better do that too. But, Alexandra, to you, why, after everything we now know, does big public health has not lost its gravitas and that veneer of credibility like it should?
Well, first of all, if Sweden has taught us anything, it's that, first of all, countries are prepared to bully each other to protect their own policies, which is what we saw happen to Sweden, where they were bribing and bullying them into upholding the total COVID lockdown scheme. The second thing we learned is that modelling for computers is absolutely garbage if you put rubbish and unknowns in. And Big Health has been using both of these concepts in order to maintain what's being called a medical tyranny, or a system of usurping other laws based upon computer modelling and advice, and often flimsy advice that doesn't provide any actual data that goes with it. And you're right, we have copied China's model, aside from actually welding people into apartment buildings, which, to be honest, Melbourne's not far off of. We've pretty much gone down the China route. And then China stopped really giving the world statistics anymore. And so we've got ourselves trapped in this endless COVID zero race with no end in sight. And
don't forget, Alexandra, I mean, the comparisons are very, very real with the welding. Don't forget last year that the state government of Victoria, a centre-left or far-left government, depending on which way you look at it, took our most vulnerable citizens living in public housing units and turned those into basically gigantic prisons. I'm amazed there wasn't a riot or a fire or something, but nevertheless, the experiment seemed to work out.
Close to it. We don't like being locked down like you guys in Melbourne. We're relatively hostile to our restrictions.
Oh, in New South Wales. Well, we'll get to New South Wales in a minute. And
actually, I want to cut in there because I find Australians are the most sheep-like people. I'm stunned. I mean, even New South Wales, there has been very little pushback. Up here in Queensland, people walk around with face masks by themselves. I'm quite disappointed at the level of...
Oh, James, you should hear the conversations in the streets of Sydney. People are not on public transport because they don't want to obey the mask rules, not because they're still virus.
I'm coming down for a protest march.
Well, I would rather...
Come join us.
Well, I would rather crawl to work than abide by those sort of, restrictions and things like that. But, James, to the extent people are scared and they're sheep and so on, I'm a bit more optimistic than that. I just think that the fear has really turned people in some respects into unrecognisable from Australians I once knew and loved. And I think a part of the reason for that is that the media has not done its job at pushing back critically against...
hopeless.
Yeah, hopeless. Now,
Spectator Australia's side and Adam Creighton in the Australian, who's been excellent, and Steve Watterson, it's just a desert of fear porn.
Yeah. Well, look at Weissner's article on Fauci. I mean, the people who are helping to create the scenario we now live in were the ones who came out and now telling us what we can and can't do.
Well, I'll cut in because, Jim, you had a great piece in the Spectator Australia this month called Pravda Rides Again, and you wrote that the unfree press problem is not one of having an identifiable editorial line. Fair enough. No, the unfree press problem is a combination of double standards, that is, one approach for your side of politics and another for theirs, lack of scepticism as regards the pronouncements and claims of the political and expert classes, and coming across, when it suits, as mouthpieces for the ruling elite. Now, when did independent journalists become basically water carriers and stenographers for the government? Something is not working as it should here.
It's been incredibly disappointing throughout the pandemic. I was asked, what's the main problem? I think one of the problems, and I'm just speculating here, is that so many of the young journalists go through universities these days. I work at an Australian university. Law schools lean left massively, but let me tell you, the journalism schools would make the law schools look like they were, balanced. One of the things we're lacking is if you go back 20, 25 years, you're getting a cadre of journalists who learned by the apprentice method, and they went into the newsroom and, they got hard bitten. They might have their own views, but they learned about, sort of disinterested reporting. They learn about critical race theory and the importance of, achieving your godlike version of posing. We have had no skepticism at all amongst whole chunks. I mean, how many times do you hear that on the worst case, the survival rate for COVID is 99.7%?
Yeah.
The average life expectancy is lower than the average age of death of COVID. Or the Americans, if you get 50,000 people under 50 with COVID and put them in a stadium, only one will die. I mean, people don't, it's worse than the flu. There's no doubt about it. If you're obese, it's particularly bad. And if you're really old.
Yeah, and Alexandra, isn't that the problem, though, as Jim identified, which is that we've lost, the working class journalist and the apprentice journalist, and we've replaced it with the rise of the journalism degree. We have effectively taken the country's best and brightest writing and reporting talent, fed it through the meat grinder of university sensibilities, and unleashed these new journalists on the media. And it's not just the journalism degree; it's basically every sector of the professional classes, because of the way university degrees are, spreading these ideas through HR departments and the like. But, like everything else, this problem starts at our university, surely.
I know for a fact that I wouldn't make it through a journalism degree at university because I would basically, there's no way I could sit through a class of people like that. I sat in on an English class once with one of my friends who was taking it, and I lasted about 20 minutes before the race politics and the critical race theory it did me in. But we were talking about the free press. Jane Allen's piece was wonderful, but there are 3 points. It's why are the press choosing to be unfree and having their double standards? Well, if it's social media, the social media companies are getting political kickbacks for enforcing this double narrative. If it's the ABC or the BBC, well, they're trying to secure public funding in their interest to protect their political favourites. But if it's the private media or a large media corporation, well, they're protecting their audience and their clicks. So you've got 3 different motivations that's essentially bringing the same double standard about across the board. And all you've really got is the rise of independent journalism, which is a big deal these days, and places like the Spectator, who value independent opinion.
Absolutely, and that's a great reminder to subscribe to the Spectator Australia. Get rid of the garbage that the mainstream media is feeding you. The Spectator Australia is certainly not in the pocket of the deep state or the political and cultural elite. That's for sure. But Alexandra, on the media, I could forgive having a left-wing mainstream media if it wasn't more and more difficult for the few voices of truth to speak up. And on that, we had a great article this month from Coburn in our international section about Tucker Carlson being spied on by the NSA, an organ of the state, in the US for the purpose of having the show cancelled. In the United States, of all places, the home of the First Amendment, you have government agencies trying to stifle dissenting voices. What has happened here? What has gone wrong?
Well, this story is so close to being what looks like fake news. You've got no idea whether it's theatre or it's reality. That's how far these things have gone in the US. They're a little bit ahead of Australia. We haven't quite got to this stage yet. And reading the article, which was hilarious, by the way, well done to the author, it sounded like the government sources and intelligence sources was a scene out of the BBC in the Loop, where they've got this Iceman unknown confidant going around talking about these theories and no one knows what's happening. That's what it's evolved into. That's where the press is at the moment. That's where the government is. It looks like these anonymous big state, we did it, but we didn't do it. Who knows what to believe? But it is entertaining.
Oh, look, it's always entertaining until it's not. Now, moving on, James, you've been an outspoken critic in the pages of the Spectator Australia and elsewhere about, left-wing liberals, modern liberals, moderates, call them what you will, and the extent to which they're, really diluting the good ideas and the impact of the Liberal Party and the coalition as we know it. There was a typically fantastic article by Judith Sloan this month in The Spectator. Now, it's sadly out of date because she begins it saying, the Berejiklian government in New South Wales is rightly patted on the back for its mature approach to the management of COVID relative to other states. Well, that doesn't really hold water anymore, but nevertheless, she said, though, on every other measure, it's just a pathetic left-of-centre outfit pandering to all the fashionable woke and climate-related causes. Many of the ministers would fit in very well with the Labor Party, actually make that the Greens. I couldn't have put it better myself. But Jim, what do you think?
I thought she was too kind to the Liberal Party. If anything, I actually used to get into arguments here last year with people saying, oh, it's a gold standard, Berejiklian, with the lockdowns. But by Australian standards, she was actually the best by a mile. But by broader, certainly by Florida, Texas standards, she's been awful. And you were just waiting for her to crumple. They've got this is the home of woke with Matt Keane on energy policy. They haven't done much with the school curriculum that anybody would want to stand up to. Most of the blame, in my view, goes back to Scott Morrison and his innovation of a national cabinet. So this is nothing in our Constitution. He made it up. He provided a platform for these premiers, and he probably didn't realize it, but it's in the context of us having the most dysfunctional federal system in the world. We're the only federation in the world where the states have no income tax power, so they're effectively mendicants. So if they impose incredibly despotic, heavy-handed rules, they don't pay any of the financial costs. And so Morrison has set up a world where, Dan Anderson can bring in the world's most sort of heavy-handed lockdowns. And when the entire economy crumbles, if you did that in the US, your tax base, voters in Victoria would be paying for that. In Australia, people in Perth and Brisbane and Sydney are paying for that. So in that sense, they pay none of the costs, or the costs are incredibly moderated by everyone else chipping in. And this has all been created by Morrison. He had a chance to join the Section 92 challenge to the High Court. He didn't do it. He's a man who's never really indicated any sense of values or principles. Free speech is a third order issue that doesn't create any jobs, which is wrong on a factual level and stupid on a principled level. And so he's put himself in a spot where he hasn't even been able to criticize Dan Andrews for his lockdowns. And I think they're now starting to feel that they've created a diabolical situation for themselves.
I think that's the mistake that National Cabinet has been. It's elevated these premiers to the same level as the Prime Minister. It's given them this cover. He can't criticise National Cabinet colleagues, and they can do whatever they like, knowing that Canberra will pick up the tab.
Right. Meanwhile, the proper cabinet, the people we elected and who were put in the real cabinet, have been downgraded to sort of junior advisor status. And, meanwhile, these people are personally paying none of the costs. So they impose rules on the rest of us. Mr. Morrison jets off to the G7. He stops. Where did he stop? Singapore. He goes off to visit his family stuff in Cornwall. My premier wants to go off to Tokyo. We can't get out to see dying relatives. And they don't even, Mr. Morrison, my wife and I had to go through hotel quarantine. He can't leave the room. He has quarantine in the lodge. I'm betting it's nicer. What do you think? You think it's better to quarantine in the lodge?
Oh, I don't know. The Holiday Inn at Tullamarine might be pretty nice for 2 weeks.
Yeah, I would have thought it's pretty good.
Of course, Scott Morrison made this decision because quarantine is a federal issue. And he didn't want to take the responsibility for something he knew would be unpopular because the decisions were going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
And so instead we've got National Cabinet to absolve himself of what should have been his decision. And with Gladys Berejiklian, for anybody, watching, she's been playing a dissenter Liberal for a long time and a moderate, but really she's part of the Photius faction. So people like Matt Keane, who are mentioned in the article, are there holding these positions of power and coming out with these ridiculous money-wasting policies because Gladys agrees with him, not because he's sitting there from some other reason. And we have to remember that.
And this is the thing, I wasn't a huge Gladys admirer. I thought she was okay, and I was very impressed by the way in which she resisted lockdowns until she didn't. But I really don't mean to pick on Gladys. It is an issue of the people who sit around that cabinet table, not least of all that revolting Matt Keane, as we all know. But it's not just the Liberal Party, it's the Nats. And I just want to stay with Judith's article because I think this is worth going into. Pork barrelling with a touch of agrarian socialism sums up the party's approach to government in New South Wales. Now, that to me is what the Nats were always about. When I was a kid, the Nats were the lousy ministers who just wanted pork, and they were sort of an afterthought, and the Liberal Party needed to govern. But if you look federally, the Nationals are fantastic. You've got people like Matt Canavan and Bridget McKenzie and George Christensen. I mean, these are people who are really holding the show together and giving me hope. So, Alexandra, you're a country girl. I mean, are the Nats the hope of the side and the hope of the future?
Well, the Nat Party, the whole point of their existence is to, like tent pegs, to peg back the Liberal Party and hold them to the more conservative side of politics that stop them from chasing Labor all the way off into oblivion with the Greens. And again, you can't let Gladys off the hook because she put Matt Keane, a radical, almost green member in charge of energy and the environment, because that's her politics reflects what she believes. And so she's careful with her leadership that she remains popular within the Liberal majority, but she is empowering people with dangerous ideas. And the article goes through the amount of money being wasted on these energy schemes put out by Matt Keane, when we're completely broke. I mean, the state is in such immense debt. We shouldn't be throwing hundreds of millions of dollars around trying to get people to buy electric cars. But on that point, we've got Europe, where Norway, which is by far the highest uptake of electric cars, now has a battery problem on the rise, where they can't the batteries properly. And so, because they tend to explode when you take them apart, it's a slight problem there. And so Matt Keane and Gladys in Sloane's article are going down this massive renewable spend, pushing Australia toward what's going to be a rubbish problem for ourselves, while at the same time they're going to ban our coffee cups and our plastic, which is another of Matt Keane's policies he announced a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, and this...
And, while you're on that, because I agree with you, Alexandra, but they pretend that the batteries have been dropped by God from the sky. Nobody counts the carbon cost in building the batteries. Like here at UQ, you will see university vehicles driving around and they say zero emissions vehicles. Well, there's zero emissions if you pretend that the battery was created by some benevolent God at no carbon cost at all. I mean, it's just propaganda. I just want to say one thing.
They say net zero, but that comes in little quotation marks.
Zero way down here.
And people aren't buying Teslas because the government told them to. They buy them because they like them. So the idea that
they can afford to
sway the market by throwing cash at it's not going to work.
Look, when Judith said that the Nats, deliver a sort of a touch of agrarian socialism, I aspire to a national government with Josh Frydenberg, who's only a touch of socialism. He has delivered the most massive degree of socialism this past year. He's exploded the budget. Anybody looking at what's happened would say this is the greatest sort of intergenerational theft of the entire country's history. This is borrowing from our children and our grandchildren for oldies. And that's all the loose fiscal policy. And then the loose monetary policy is actually transferring wealth from people without assets to people with assets. So basically, it's an immoral disgrace. We have borrowed from the young to give to the old, and we borrowed from the poor to give to the rich. People who have done best are the sort of bureaucratic class. And this has been presided over by a sort of supposedly right of center coalition government. I didn't vote for this in 2019, and I'm not voting for them again.
Yeah.
Until change. I can't do it.
If you want to talk about nationals, Gideon, what nationals? Because we've got people like Leslie Williams up where I am who just defected from the Nationals to go and join the Liberals. So, and there's a few more who are just like her, who are basically Liberals wearing a National shirt.
Well, that's right. And you know, don't forget the Nationals have lost, 3 seats of by-elections relatively recently to the Shooters and Fishers. I think it's 3 Orange and Ballina. Well, they lost Ballina to the Greens, which will tell you everything you need to know. When you look at New South Wales Nationals versus the federal Nationals, which have really held the show together, it's the old go woke, go broke on a political scale. And the fact that politicians persist with these idiotic green policies despite the fact that nobody's voting for them beggars belief. But just to finish, Alexandra, you had a wonderful long read, a really, really good and thought-provoking piece that was called Digital Darkness, the Third Apocalypse. And you wrote very optimistically that the more advanced and complicated a civilization, the easier it is to destroy. Far from heeding this long acknowledged fact, modern nations have decided to hinge their essential services on the deceptively fragile digital world. Wow, that's a pretty ominous warning. Talk us through that one.
Well, when you work and live in the IT world like I have and like my father has, you start to realize how fragile the entire digital world actually is and what it hinges on. And a lot of people in the world, as we become increasingly encouraged to put our lives online and to rely on online services for our banking and our politics and our security, forget that these cloud services that appear to be everywhere for us are actually just a few banks of service consolidated in a country. And all of these ideas of an obsession with security and digital safety are meaningless in the realm of a true geopolitical conduct. So, for example, it's Amazon service can be taken down by a few well-placed Chinese missiles, to be honest, and then the entire Western world collapses. Now, people in my industry have known this for a long time. We talk about it all the time. But when it comes into the mainstream, they look at you like you're a conspiracy theorist. You're like, no, hold on. You have to understand how fragile the world is that you are living in. But the article itself is also talking about the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and what these people who are in charge of COVID and climate change cults and these bureaucracies, what they're thinking about and planning for our digital future. And I suffered through some of Klaus Schwab's 2 novels, which are just, don't do it. Don't do it yourself. I read it and you don't have to. But they are frightening how they're going to manipulate our digital world to basically entrap us in COVID, but worse. They even refer to it as like a digital pandemic with COVID attributes to show you how far off these guys are.
It could happen. That's why we all need to embrace blockchain technology in a glorious decentralized as opposed to cloud-based future, but that's my own personal...
Oh, you're the optimistic one, Gideon. All of it ends up at a server somewhere.
Not if it's decentralized. I'm pessimistic about big government, but I'm deeply optimistic about the glorious decentralized future that blockchain technology and cryptocurrency can unleash for us all. Remember, not financial advice. Consult your own tax advisor before making investment decisions.
I'm going to hold it. Now, I told you so back in the wings for you, Gideon.
I want to know why you guys care about Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter. I mean, if the Chinese are the only ones who'll take them down, maybe we should be encouraging the Chinese. This big tech is so one-sided and so censorious. By that, I mean they censor anyone on the right side of politics. Imagine taking down a past president and just basically erasing him. So, I mean, I take all Alexandra's points and they are worrying in some sense, but the sort of social media, which I don't do at all because I just have a heart attack.
James, I wouldn't be here talking to you today if it wasn't for Twitter. That's how I became a writer. But also my concerns were more to do with the banking sector, which is at our national security industry, which is on those servers as well.
Well, decentralized currency removes the need for banks altogether. But you're right, James, I suppose, in one sense, which is we're all entitled to a bit of schadenfreude. Big tech thinks they can take down Trump. Well, let's see how you like it when the Chinese take down you. that's all the stories we have for today. But very, very quickly, and I appreciate this is without notice, what do you guys have in contemplation for the Spectator Australia? Jim, anything in the works?
I have a piece on diversity that Rowan's put off for a week. It's just explaining how the diversity sort of religion has taken over universities and then big business. And of course, it wasn't hard to take over the sort of bureaucratic class because they were a sort of willing market. But it's something that we need to fight back against. I don't expect this government to fight back against anything, but at some point we'll elect people who have evolved past the invertebrate stage, and then maybe something can happen.
Well, I'll throw it to somebody who is definitely not here as a diversity appointment. Alexandra, what do you have for us?
I was going to try my luck with how socialism destroyed Africa. I've been reading some very interesting pieces about that. It's socialism that holds Africa back and keeps it in poverty and a constant state of war. And that would definitely win me some friends online. Probably get me cancelled.
Yeah, no. You're right. Socialism has destroyed so many countries. The free market is the answer, indeed, in many of the most emerging parts of Africa, among other places. But that's all the time we have for this month. But thank you to you both for being the inaugural review panel for all the wonderful articles we have here at the Spectator Australia. Catch up soon.
Thank you, Gideon. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Well, this program is a co-production of the Institute of Public Affairs. For 78 years and counting, the IPA has been Australia's voice for freedom, democracy and the Australian way of life. We fight for freedom of speech, the power of the free market, an honest debate on climate change and the timeless value of Western civilization. Now, we don't receive a cent from government and are not beholden to nervous advertisers. We speak out only because of the support of the thousands of great Australians who are proud, paid-up IPA members. So sign up now to the Institute of Public Affairs and support our important research, as well as receive exclusive benefits like priority access and discounts to IPA events, our quarterly magazine, the IPA Review, our weekly email roundup for freedom enthusiasts called Hey, What Did I Miss? Regular updates from Executive Director John Roscombe offering his take on the tough issues of the week, policy updates from our gun research team giving you all the ammunition you need to own that lifty mate at your next insufferable dinner party, and some merch as well. And of course, on top of all that, you'll be supporting the IPA's work in defending freedom, democracy and the Australian way of life. Just head on over to ipa.org.au/join, sign up today and join Australia's voice for freedom. And now it is a great pleasure to welcome back the covers editor right here of the Spectator Australia, Sarah Dudley. Sarah, welcome back. And how are you up there in lockdown in New South Wales?
Well, we're doing our best. We had it a lot better than you did down in Melbourne. And it's really great to see you, Gideon.
Oh, always good to see you. Well, we're all in this together, Sarah. Stay safe. Now that's out of the way, let's talk about this week's cover. Brilliant statement, very true, very apt historical parallel that I've made time and time again. But over to you, talk us through it.
Well, the cover story is by Darryl McCann, and it is a wake-up call for anyone who still thinks that China's ambition at reunification with Taiwan is on the back burner. And this week's cover actually tackles that issue head on. It's a map of China with the name China dominating the page. There's only one other word on the cover, and you have to look for it. It's Czechoslovakia, and it's placed slap bang in the middle of Taiwan. Because, Gideon, it looks rather reminiscent of 1938 out there. And as all history buffs know, there was a certain German chancellor who was mad keen on something called the Anschluss, which is basically the German word for, reunification. And that was also one of his favorite topics. And he didn't hold back. Austria first, then Czechoslovakia in 1938, Poland the following year, which started World War II. Well, back to the present day, Xi Jinping has already forced reunification on Hong Kong, and earlier this month told a crowd of 70,000 fanboys in Tiananmen Square that it was his duty to invade Taiwan. And I'm frankly not looking forward to the Poland moment. Anyhow, the cover, which is designed to resemble a 1930s map, I guess is a timely reminder to those who are reluctant to heed the warnings of history.
You're right, Sarah, and this is what I have been saying all along, time and time again. Hong Kong was Austria. Czechoslovakia will be Taiwan, God forbid, but that's the way it may very well be looking. And yeah, what's Poland under that scenario? To my mind, it's either India, Japan, or, God forbid, Australia. So anybody who's still playing down this threat does so at their peril. Now, you also brought in another cover for us, one from our friends in the United Kingdom. What have you got for us there?
Well, a British cover caught my eye this month, Gideon. The headline is Stage Fright, which is what many politicians seem to suffer from when it comes to unlocking Britain's lockdowns. The cover shows a fabulously theatrical tennis match being played in the Shaftesbury Avenue Theatre, with hundreds of fans packed in like sardines, which is designed to show how the government is putting on a handful of mass sporting events just to prove to the world that Britain's COVID lockdowns are over. Yeah, right. Whilst the reality is that the goalposts keep changing, moving further and further into the never, never. But it is interesting to note that Boris Johnson has changed tack recently, and he's switched from his very authoritarian, it's the law to wear a mask, to stick to your bubble, to go into lockdown on a whim, to making it all about personal responsibility. Well, we've heard that before. And hopefully Gladys Berejiklian here in New South Wales will remember that it's far better to appeal to our common sense than to lock us up for weeks at a time, which she used to agree with. Well, let's just hope that the economy doesn't take too big a hit this time.
Well, we shall see. But as I said at the top of the show this month, Sarah, the stupid phrase, we're all in this together, I used to say it's a lie. I think we've actually been mishearing them. They haven't been saying we're all in this together. They've been saying we're all in this forever, but let's hope the winds of change sweep through. In the meantime, Sarah, great to see you again as always. Fantastic front cover this week. Looking forward to catching up next month and seeing what you come up with next.
Excellent, Gideon. See you then.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, that's it for this month's edition of CounterCulture right here on Spectator Australia TV. Remember to sign up for regular updates with Morning Double Shot over at spectator.com.au. And remember to access all the content from the Spectator Australia, just call 1800 809 233 and quote Spectator Australia TV. Until next time, friends.